fifth grade. Really ain't no difference if that nigga gay.
Blood satellite.
But before we go, I wanted to briefly talk about this book I read that ties into what we were talking about previously, talking about these systems that were that how people can behave within these systems and how they move around. There's this book, and I don't love this book, but it had a lot going for it. So it was this book called Political Ponerology. It's subtitled The Science of Evil, Psychopathy. God, I'm stupid. Start over. Cut.
Humiliation.
It's a book called Political Ponerology, The Science of Evil, Psychopathy, and the Origins of Totalitarianism. Right? It's written by Andrew M. Jesus Christ. Lobaczewski.
Yeah.
I'm going to, whatever. These people got to get their act together with their names. Anyway, so I'm going to read you the back of this. And there's a lot of good stuff in this book. And I don't know if the story behind it is completely true, but I think you need to hear the story of this book. So, okay. It's published by Red Pill Press. Just don't use that against it. Whatever. Here's this. The first manuscript of this book was thrown into the fire just minutes before the secret police raid in communist Poland. The second copy was personally delivered to a contact inside the Vatican, only to mysteriously vanish. Okay, just sidebar there. Just mailing something to the Vatican and not hearing back about it doesn't mean that it was on its way to the Pope and someone intercepted it. Okay. The third was pieced together in the 1980s New York by the last surviving member of an underground research team, only to be banned from publication until now. Okay, whatever. Forged in the Crucible of Totalitarianism, Political Ponerology is written by psychiatrist Dr. Andrew Dem, who draws on his experience and clinical insight during the decades he spent under the crushing heel of Nazi and communist regimes. Now, I think that part's true. That part, I think, is accurate. Now, this has come from a guy who lived in Nazi-occupied Poland and I believe communist-occupied Poland. Or at some point he was living in a communist, Soviet-occupied country. So he's got personal stakes in this thing called totalitarianism. And what this book seeks to do in a very 20th century sort of way is say what happens to groups who kind of go insane. It was this idea of... It's built on the idea of evil. So ponerology, and I might be pronouncing that incorrectly, but it's charming when I do it. Ponerology is the study of evil. It's literally the study of evil. What is evil? How does it operate from a clinical psychiatric point of view, from a psychological point of view? We know we have this idea of evil. There are evil people. We can agree that certain... You hear about these serial killers. You hear about a Jeffrey Dahmer. You hear about these unspeakably atrocious acts, and you say... These people got to be evil. They're like a different class of person. But then you sit down from a scientific perspective and say, well, what is evil? How do we classify it? Can we tell when someone is evil? Can we tell when someone's going to be evil? These are the questions they ask. Now, this ties into our last talk about the Tavistock Institute, because I don't agree with a lot of the conclusions that this guy came to. However, I do see them anchored in his experience and his experience within the 20th century. So, and I think it's an interesting endeavor to go about to scientifically pin down what evil is. But he has his issues, and those might be his prejudices or the world he thinks he can create. So, for example, the reason he's doing this, he's writing this book, and he's interested in this, is because he believes that the things that make someone evil are just psychological illnesses, or they're just quirks, and then you can fix those with psychiatric drugs. And in a sense that he's saying that evil as sort of a malicious or spiritual malaise, it's not their fault in a sense. He's like, evil people are actually just insane, and you can't really punish insane people. So his is a very individualist, liberal interpretation of how to react to evil. And by evil, I mean truly evil, about people. I read about I was reading this other book called On Killing. We'll cover that soon too. But it was this book about how people react to murder, how to get people to murder, and the effect that murdering someone has on your mind and PTSD and things like that, and what can drive people to kill, most importantly. And he was talking about how there was this one case of a guy, he was a peacekeeper, I think he was part of the UN peacekeepers, and he was in the Congo. And he came across a scene. It was a church. And you can already tell that this isn't starting off good. But I'm just going to try and just skip through it. But essentially, he found like a young white nun being tortured by these two black, I guess, militia people, whatever, soldiers. And they were like putting out cigarettes on her nipples. They're about to rape her. He eventually kills them and stops them from doing this and cuts them apart. And it was kind of the story about the effect it had on him. But what he didn't notice was, oh, she survived. Here's this older nun, like an 80-year-old nun, who they murdered and cut the breasts off and shoved severed genitals up her vagina. Where the genitals come from? Well, the guy out back who was like stapled to a fucking table and her breasts are stapled to him. So you look at that and you say, well, that's evil. What else do you call it? What else do you call that when you behold an atrocity and these people, they think it's funny? Okay, what is that? But he would say, well, that's just environmental, that's just circumstantial, and he's more of a rehabilitation sort of guy. And he thinks that the way we punish evil people is barbarous. You know, this kind of runs up against what we were saying in the last episode, that you just got to sometimes kill these people. Like, you're just the people on death row, just fucking kill them. There's no redeeming them. He disagrees. And this is what a lot of psychologists will do. They'll say, no, but this is a problem. This is a puzzle. We can unravel this and solve evil. We could even predict evil. And that's really, at the end of the day, why we take exception to a lot of these psychology people, because what they're trying to do is predict evil and head it off in the past. And so how do they define those markers? Well, that's up to them. So maybe disagreeing with Joe Biden is a way we can track down evil that's going to happen eventually, or someone who likes Trump, whatever it might be. You know, you're putting a lot of faith in these fucking assholes who have their own prejudices that they just think are naturally correct. So that's where I would disagree with him. And he talks almost like, he talks about evil like something that there's no such thing as mental illness. There's only evil that spreads. So it's kind of this, he kind of brings them together. So we would say something like, okay, if you have trauma inflicted on you, that would probably give you some kind of mental breakage. He would say that's just a ponerologic, characteropathic force spreading into you. That you would look at, let's say you're trying to, like an MK Ultra experiment, you're trying to break someone down, you're trying to break their mind to make them susceptible. What you're doing is almost spreading evil to them. So I'm like, okay, I see what you're doing. Like you're trying to psychoanalyze evil, but you're also destroying the idea of trauma. Because as trauma, we understand, we know what trauma is, we know what PTSD is. He would almost, in the process of doing this, he would almost make PTSD seem like a spiritual evil thing. Like you got possessed by evil that we can fix. So like that's the trade-off I get in this book. So I'm just outlining my objections to this book before I start saying what I like about it. But that's just one thing he says. And he uses the word characteropathic by saying, like, if you're a psychopath or if you're a sociopath, you fall under this umbrella, things like that. So I'll give a brief outline of what I'm talking about here. So he said, and I believe in this, he says, if we want to make ideologies and sciences that last, we need to take into account the fragility of the human mind and personality defects. And I believe this, and this is why I like this book. It's something that we had talked about a lot before, that in doing anything political or any sort of movement or hell, any scene, anything that seems to have any social power or accumulate social capital, you're going to get people who are attracted to that, not because they're believers or they're doers or they're agents of change. They're just fucked up people. And I've gotten in trouble in the past by saying that maybe I shouldn't do this, but for our political scene, I am suspicious of anyone with anarchist priors. Now, that's not to say I don't like anarchists. There's a lot of people in our groups, even yourself, even maybe myself, who had anarchist leanings in the past. But I found more evidence that people who are anarchists before, who become kind of right-wing, quote, they just bring a lot of weird fucking baggage, and they're just destructive antisocial forces who've kind of found a new clique to pair up with, you know? And that they would, in the event that anyone on the right won, they would turn on them as well. So that's kind of what I'm talking about. So within these systems, you got to say, like, okay, there are certain people who have certain psychological tendencies. And I think you need to look at, like, we might be against psychologists. We might be against certain things psychologists do, but there is this thing called psychology. There is this thing called PTSD, for example, that affects how you see the world. There is such a thing of people having certain imbalances in their brain, or they're prone to certain behavioral problems, and that could be due to trauma in the past, that could be due to a lot of other stuff. But there are certain roadblocks you get with certain people where it's just difficult. If you put them in a leadership position, they'll fuck things up. It doesn't matter how strong their ideology or their beliefs are. And if you have a priest who just kind of fucked up, they're going to be a bad priest. The fact that they're a priest doesn't fix everything about them. So in some way, you just need to be aware of the fact that psychological considerations exist. That's kind of where I'm starting with. Does that sound sensible?
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
Okay. So he makes some, and when he says, okay, there's this thing called sort of ponerology, there is this thing, if we looked at the example we'll give would be, let's say the Soviet Union, let's say communism, that here's a framework that was started by, whatever you feel about them, idealists, right? Started by people who believed in it. Over time, the whole the system, not just the leaders, but the system, the organizational structure, the managerial class, as we might call it, became filled with corrupted, fucked up people who are not idealists, who are just probably insane. And we can say that's the communists. We could say that's us right now. That the mechanisms of the state, the body politic itself, becomes occupied by these just fucked up people. The people who are just clout chasers, they're credentialists, they just want power for the sake of it. They want to abuse their power. They're just creatures. They're just parasites. And so the thing is, like, how can those people can take over a system is kind of what he's saying. So within any successful system, you have to be aware that there's certain forces that can infiltrate that system and take it over and essentially turn that system, that government, that group, whatever, into their own fucking twisted playground.
Right.
And there's people out there who are Stalinists, but you could say like people who rose up the rank. You could say even in Hitler's Germany, even if you like Hitler, you have to realize there are certain sadists who rose up the ranks, and this is in every fucking system. And you have to realize that they could hijack the system and use it for their own ends. And then the system just becomes an oppressive force against the people. And people who grew up in like second world countries, former Soviet bloc countries, and the types of people who become the police just because it's a new type of gang and they just want to rob the people. These are the people we're talking about. And these are psychopaths very often, and they are very good at wearing whatever mask they want to wear at the time. And they're very good at gathering people around them. And he kind of breaks down the system. Now, where I also disagree with him, and this is where his liberal individualism comes out, where he says, he pretty much makes the claim that any sort of ideology by necessity has to be by psychopaths and outsiders. But there is something to that, right? Because if you think about it, the people who lead revolutions tend to be outsiders. They're people who are kind of on the outside of whatever that system is, because they have to be, unless it's like a coup, like a military coup. That's another thing. But even still, that's kind of similar. But they tend to be people in the fringes. That was, that was Hitler. That was the communists. That was anarchists. That's everyone. That's why they tend to gather so much strength from the fringes in a Juvenalian sense. But he would also say that the fringes are full of people who are like bitter and insane and mean, and they gather up their forces to wage war on the system. And that to do this, you kind of have to be insane. And in a sense, I agree with that. In a sense, I think that because why would anyone do any of this? The easy life is just to kind of exist in the system and be a slave. You don't actually have to put your life on the line. As bad as it might be, be as bad as living as like a fucking white person in this system is, it's worse being in prison, but you run that risk anyway, because maybe you're kind of insane. Maybe you are surrounded by insane people, but you kind of need some kind of personality defect in his mind. But I do agree with this, to look at the world and say, I can make it better. That is kind of crazy, right? To say, I'm going to change this whole fucking system. We're all kind of crazy for thinking that. But maybe that's because we're all crazy. And so he says only ideologies can kind of be made by emotionally imbalanced people. And he would say that, okay, it took him a while to get to this in the book, but I'm like, okay, what is the standard here? What is a normal person? And maybe even we might disagree with this, but he would say like, okay, a normal person is someone who doesn't have any, psychological problems. Like they're not sad and crazy all the time. They're not anxious all the time. They don't have any trauma, and they are of moderate intelligence. Okay, so we can maybe even disagree with that. I don't think the normie as we know it exists, but to say that something is mentally unwell, you need a standard for mental wellness. And I think, okay, just someone average intelligence, let's say you average white intelligence.
I think that's reasonable.
Yeah. So anyone who's not that, I'm like, well, that could be a crazy person, or that could be like a really driven person. You don't know, but maybe those are one and the same in a lot of ways. That's kind of what he's saying here. But that's why he also thinks that American identity needs to be fixed to sort of a secular humanism that can be achieved through psychology, which, by the way, is what the Tavistock Institute talks about, which is what a lot of these psychologists talk about. That's Sam Harris, secular humanist. Jordan Peterson. I almost said Jordan Peele. Jordan Peterson, secular humanist. Even though he's got a lot of gestures towards religion and stuff, he is in essence a secular humanist. And then, he will say that, and if you are anything outside of that, you've been brainwashed. And like I said before, he substitutes brainwashing and trauma, and it's all spreading mental illness. So the default is you just being a self-interested individual. If you believe anything else, you've been brainwashed, and being brainwashed is just infecting you with mental illness. Now, maybe I disagree with that, but maybe I also agree with it. Maybe you are mentally ill if you care about this stuff. But that also means everyone's mentally ill.
Yeah, exactly.
So I don't know whether I feel like I disagree with that, but maybe I don't. Maybe I do agree that we are just in a world where everyone's mentally ill and everyone wants to change the world. And maybe this is just what you get when you get that. He had made a comment in the book. He said the Germans regarded those who felt angst and thus seek out unique pathways to solve that angst are the vanguards of civilization, but he disagrees. So the Germans had this idea that the people who feel like angst is very powerful in German identity. We don't really have that. We talk about angst, like I feel anxious, but angst is a deep thing within the Germanic people, really. But he says that actually in searching for that new pathway, in searching for trying to find a new way to do society, he says that's a pathway where you can just lead to evil, which is true, actually. And I think I agree with that. I disagree with the ideal society, but I think that you do need to be aware that as you're trying to chart a new pathway for society, and many of people around you know that the system right now fucking sucks, there's a lot of off-ramps into just evil behavior, and you might be surrounded by people who are just there because they want power for themselves. And they will have the ability, and if you've ever been in a group, you can see these sorts of people. So remove it from politics. Think about if you were ever in school, if you were in college or high school, and you had a group of people, and then one toxic individual turns that group against you or someone else, or kind of bends it to their own selfish will. All he's saying is that can exist on a national level. That can exist in, maybe you're not leading the country, but there's a good, who's a good movie for this, and it's based on a true story. It's The Death of Stalin. So if you want a visual like example, and that's got Steve Buscemi in it, that's got a lot of people. It's got Jeffrey Tambor in it. Very good, kind of a very, very dark comedy. But the character of, I forget his name was Beria, but he was in charge of the NKVD, I believe, or might have been anyway, he was in charge of the police, and he was a guy, and this was him in real life too. He was known to be this guy, but just like short, fat, lecherous piece of shit. He was there because he liked torturing people. He liked it. He thought it was cool. He would arrest men, put them in jail, so their wives would have to fuck him, so he would let them out. He would do stuff like that. He was a known rapist. He was a known guy who liked torturing for the sake of it, and he rose up the ranks, and he was at a level where people were afraid of him because he had all the power. Not as the figurehead, but his little spies, his little birdies throughout. And so even the people at his level were very aware of him and very afraid of him, not to cross him. So you could see, even within these huge institutions, think to your own life. You know that every institution can be corrupted by individuals like this. And he talks about it in the book. He was talking about even in his university, he watched how certain, even if you're on the center right here, talk about how leftist professors infiltrated and turned the entire schools to their wills over time, over a relatively short amount of time. He would look at that process. He would describe that as sort of like mental illness / evil spreading. And in a sense, he's right, because you could say that a lot of the times this isn't even ideologically done. In the case of Beria in the Soviet Union, it's like he just wanted power. He just wanted to fuck and get money and eat food. That's it. And he would just wear the faceplate of the ideologue. But, you know, but that's how that system gets corrupted. And you don't know how to, at that point, you might not know how to uncorrupt it. So it really does spread like a virus. Because once people lose faith in that system, this is what leads to the systems falling. And that's kind of why he's writing about this, because he says if you look at these large national systems, usually they fall under their own weight because they have become infected by these people. And I think, even though I might disagree with a lot of the conclusions and maybe the motivators for this, like, you can't deny that he seems to be coming from a place of personal experience, and he does have the history on his side, and you are looking at these things that did happen, and we know it happens in our real lives. I just disagree with the characterization of, you know, I think it's a bit more detailed than like evil, like spreading mental illness, but they're, you know, teaching mental illness through rules. But another way to look at that, and maybe this is where he's right, is the whole trans thing. Like, if you look at the people who push this stuff, they're trans themselves, but sometimes they're not. Like, look at that fucking like American trans general they just promoted.
Oh yeah.
Dr. Levine, do you believe that minors are capable of making such a life-changing decision as changing one's sex?
Well, Senator, thank you for your interest in this question. Transgender medicine is a very complex and nuanced field with robust research and standards of care that have been developed. And if I am fortunate enough to be confirmed as the Assistant Secretary of Health, I would look forward to working with you and your office and coming to your office and discussing the particulars of the standards of care for transgender medicine.
The specific question was about minors. Let's be a little more specific since you evaded the question. Do you support the government intervening to override the parent's consent to give a child puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and/or amputation surgery of breasts and genitalia? You have said that you're willing to accelerate the protocols for street kids. I'm alarmed that poor kids with no parents who are homeless and distraught, you would just go through this and allow that to happen to a minor.
You know, look, follow how many trannies are promoted in the military and watch how they spread like a virus until the military can't even fucking function anymore.
Admiral Rachel Levine is a groundbreaking leader, public health champion, and an advocate. She credits family support for helping her get where she is today.
My father has passed, but my mother is still alive, and she is quite the role model. She is a retired attorney. I've always been motivated by those who work for the benefit of others, and that's what I try to do.
Last year, Rachel made history, becoming the first openly transgender 4-star officer across uniformed services.
That's going to happen. We see it happen all around us, and we kind of say, well, everyone kind of knows that the American military is falling apart, and everyone kind of knows why, you know, and you can actually, in many cases, trace it to these people. And I think trannies are such a great case because they are so nakedly insane and corrupted, right? Like they're not political. They're a monster. Transness is a monstrosity. Transness is, I should have started with this actually. My mistake. I should have said transness is the best example because it kind of says it's political, but not really. You know, they're political in the sense that they have posed a question to the left and to liberals, and the liberals don't know how to answer it, so they begrudgingly have to accept them. So they are the most modern and the most relevant example of this happening, of them exporting their mental illness to the masses. And I think that's pretty much what this is. And to the point where even a lot of Marxists are starting to turn on them, but they don't really know how. And they're even in the minority, just like the feminists who push back are in the minority, really, if you look at it. So there's a lot here. Like, there's things that I don't agree with, but there's things that are undeniable. And I think the trans thing, and also the corrupting, malignant forces within the Soviet Union, for example, is another one. Now they could say, "Oh, by design, that was destined to happen." I'm like, I don't know, because you could see it happen in Canada. You could see it happen. That's the bureaucracy. That's the managerial elite. And as we see the power centralized in the managerial elite, you see this stuff happen all the fucking time. He talks about it here. So just to quote the book, because I want to give it its fair shake. When he's talking about the people who start ideologies, he says, "In such people, a dream emerges, like some utopia of a happy world, and a social system which will not reject them or force them to submit to laws and customs whose meaning is incomprehensible to them. They dream of a world in which their simple and radical way of experiencing and perceiving reality will dominate, where they would, of course, be assured safety and prosperity. Those others who are different, but also more technically skillful than they are, should be put to work to achieve this goal. We," they say, "after all, will create a new government, one of justice. They are prepared to fight and to suffer for the sake of such a brave new world, and also, of course, to inflict suffering upon others. Such a vision justifies killing people whose suffering does not move them to compassion because they are not quite conspecific. They do not realize that it will be a nightmarish world for those people, and they will consequently meet with the opposition that can last for generations." So they're kind of, it's hard for me to decipher if he's talking about anyone who starts like a social movement, because it could count as that. You could also count Black Lives Matter as that, maybe a bad example, but you could also kind of count unions as that in a sense. You know what I mean? There's a lot of social groups who want to like take over and affect change. And to say that they're all mentally ill and insane, if I submit to that, then we also have to say mental illness is endemic, and that is that a good or bad thing? You know, maybe it's a good thing. Maybe that's just the world we live in, and we gotta fucking deal with it. Now, who knows? And he makes a claim here, and he's a subscriber of that sort of fourth turning, everything is cyclical thing. He calls them hysteroidal cycles. And he makes the claim that in the time of plenty, we lose the capacity for criticism. And at that point, evil is intensified at every social scale, even the macro social. And so that he kind of lays that at the feet of boomers. He says like everything was going so well that evil just kind of is allowed to run free reign because no one's paying attention. Because he says the only thing that can prevent evil is criticism of it. But if no one's paying attention, then evil can just take over, basically.
Yeah.
And that's, and once they take over, he calls it a pathocracy. So this is, in short, a system that is run by mentally ill people. And he believes that any sort of mental illness is just through brain damage. So, and it could be inherited or it can be environmental. He doesn't really differentiate between the two. It doesn't even matter. And because all mental illness is just brain damage, it's something that can be fixed. And so that's why his entire worldview is rehabilitative. But even within this worldview, as you now that we've kind of read into this, now you can see the psychologist's point of view, where that anyone who wants to change the world is dangerous, right? Anyone who exhibits those personality characteristics as someone who might be an outsider and want to change, that could be that trans people are like that. They certainly are, but maybe you're not a trans person. Maybe you're just a white guy who doesn't like the legal system, or you're a man who has certain feelings about how the legal system is tilted in the favor of women. Well, you might be pathocratic. You know, you're someone who needs to be fixed. And once you remove that from any sort of moral stance or any sort of, because you could be correctly responding to a system, but within this model, there is no correct way to be an outsider who wants to change the system, because that is just some kind of mental illness, and mental illness must be fixed. So that's why I think he's right about some things, but you see what I'm saying? Because these events did happen. These systems can be taken over by pathocratic individuals, but it's so easy to admit that and then say that, of course, so anyone who wants to take over things, there's something fucked up with them. I'm like, yeah. But in that sense, then like Jewish resistance to Hitler, they were all mentally ill too. Yeah, and they are, but in a different way.
You haven't really closed the book on it, because you've opened this can of worms with essentially politics broadly, saying that anybody in a leadership position or anybody who's giving progress and action in life to society and moving in a new direction is always an insane person. And then you want to just immediately tar and say they're insane, therefore they're bad, or they're pathological, therefore it's bad. It's like, well, what you're going backwards through history and saying that every leap in well-being that we've ever made, which was all revolutionary in its time, was the result of an insane person, and we should have tried to stop them, right? It's almost to the point of a tautology that only people who are active and, or I guess we were saying earlier, people who are violent are the people who can change things. But it's like, not all change is bad, therefore not all violence is bad, and not all pathology is bad. Maybe all of this is some kind of pathology, but you need to take even saying pathology, that's a Frankfurt School Jewish thing, right? A whole concept of pathology. It's not like it's you being insane. It's differently abled. It's a different way of thinking. That's all. It's a radical and revolutionary way of thinking, and it does, in some cases, become the new normal, and many of those cases were actually a benefit to humanity. So
yeah, like when he says about these types of people, he would say that he says there's two types of deviants who facilitate a pathocracy, which is what he would call any of this. He would say characteropaths and schizoids. And characteropaths, or anything with path, like a psychopath or a sociopath, he says those two types. And the schizoids are the ones that cause problems first. So, as just like wild, crazy people and people who want to destroy. So they're the ones who are attracted to this, which is true, which actually is true. And which is why during a revolution, they actually use these people most of the time. And with Hitler, it would have been what they call the brown shirts, I think. But then with every revolution, they have the people who are just there who like street fighting, and then they're usually liquidated after. But he would say psychopaths are the ones who do this. And he defines psychopath in three ways. He says a psychopath has three elements: lack of guilt for antisocial actions, inability to love truly, and garrulousness that breaks from reality. I actually like that. I like garrulousness that breaks from reality. I might wear that on a shirt. And he says that these psychopaths are broken people and are the ones with the tactics and worldviews to facilitate the spread of evil and naturally seek each other out to build parallel systems of morality and thought. So at points in the book, he sounds like these people, they might have a certain thing, but they're not evil themselves. They just create systems that allow the facilitation of evil. So you would say like it facilitates the schizoids, just the outright crazy people like to destroy. They find a home there. And just like them, other groups along that can find a home there. And then those other groups can end up eventually infecting it, especially if the original leadership dies. And I think that's a important benchmark here, is that the founders or whatever it is die, and who takes it? Well, who's going to end up taking control? Well, probably the most manipulative, harsh, evil person. Why wouldn't they, right?
Yeah.
And then because he tracks the formation of these groups, like you can every sort of group like this, you can track to. He says ponerologic association. So in a lot of ways, he would say that the thing we're doing right now, everyone on the left and the right forming their own groups, these are ponerologic associations, which is hard to deny, because sometimes it is just, some of them are just like psycho, like some of the conspiracy theory stuff is just like mentally ill people trading fucking weird business cards and shit. But then you can't group them with everyone, which is kind of what the CIA tries to do. But you would say it usually starts with the core group, then you have to bring in others who have slightly less severity. So the ones that work, it's like you have a core group of like the diehards, then they try and make it appeal to the people who are still broken, but maybe less broken or less insane. And then you kind of build out these concentric circles from there. That's what he says. And I'll just quote here, because I do want to give quotes from the book just to show that I'm not fibbing. So he says, a primary ponerogenic union is formed at the same time as its ideology, perhaps even somewhat earlier. a normal person perceives such an ideology to be different from the world of human concepts, obviously suggestive and even cynically comical to a degree. The ideology of a secondary ponerogenic association is formed by gradual adaptation of the primary ideology to the functions and goals other than the original formative ones, which means, okay, the original group has their goals. Most people don't like it or agree with it, but you can get people in when they kind of take the gist of it and kind of form their own more practical point of view. So you still have that central, maybe very extremely militant leadership, and then it grows by losing severity to its adherents, which is interesting. A certain kind of layering or schizophrenia of ideology takes place during the ponerization process. The outer layer closest to the original content is used for the association's propaganda purposes, especially regarding the outside world, although it can in part also be used inside with regard to disbelieving lower echelon members. The second layer is initially comprehensible only to the pathological elite of the association. It is more hermetic, generally composed by slipping a different meaning into the same name. So another example of this would be Scientology, if you want something that's not political, to see how Scientology evolved over time to, L. Ron Hubbard's dead. You got David Miscavige at the center. Whatever this organization is probably isn't what it was supposed to be intended to. And if you look at how Scientology is structured, it's kind of interesting. The outermost is the most public facing, but as you graduate through it, you get the real stuff and the real purpose behind it, and like the higher level thetans, or whatever they call them, OT levels, they speak a certain language that is familiar in the organization, but it's more severe, and there's more double meanings, and they're more, this is what we're really about, and we can let you into the center now. So that is, in essence, how I think Scientology would be a good example of whatever you feel about Scientology, an example of an organization that became corrupted by just social climbers, and probably you could call them true believers, maybe even the right-hand man, as David Miscavige was to L. Ron Hubbard. But they have their own ambitions, and they have their own way of, using that just for themselves. Anyway, we've talked about this for a while. I just wanted to talk about this book, and maybe it'll come up later, because we're going to do a little bit of a psychology arc on the show right now. We started with the Tavistock Institute. Now we're going into what I think this was, which is how an organization can be corrupted by mentally ill individuals and how they can be attracted to these things.
Yeah.
And we can just substitute whatever words we want in it, but if we want to call it evil, if we want to call it ponerology, if we want to call it mental illness, whatever it is, there is this essence of this thing that spreads like a virus if you allow it to. And I do think there's truth in that. You do need to be self-critical to agree that this will inevitably happen if you don't have mechanisms to prevent it. I think that's where I came away from this book, which is a lot of the stuff he's talking about is true. It happened. It's real. There's real people who fought and died in these systems. But it's like, how do we stop the spread? Because it seems that even if we get everything we want politically, spiritually, whatever, how can we prevent it over like 500 years from succumbing to this? Once we take our hands off of the spinning plate, the spinning globe, whatever it is, because it seems that this is inevitable unless you have processes. Anyway, what do you think about that? We got to end soon, but does that make any sense? That's kind of
that's fantastic. I agree. We're going to come back to it, because it really, whether or not you agree with the specifics of the book, the general concept that there's a relationship between something you might call pathology and then either political progress, leadership, movements, revolutions. That's a big piece of pie. So I really like that, actually.
Yeah, and like when we'll say like he's blaming boomers for like, oh, the good times create good men create, what is it? Hard men create good times create weak men create hard times. So he will say, what is it about the weak men that create hard times part of that cycle? Like, what is that? It's like, is it a fact that the weak men allowed for the spread of this corruption, and realizing that corruption is not just this phenomena. Corruption is people, and perhaps there is, I think you have to pay attention to the psychological aspect of this, while also not believing in the motivations of modern psychology, even though they will never admit that they have motivations, because their motivation is secular humanism.
Yeah.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.